the way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
Welcome everyone. We're on Chapter 3, Racial Terror, to the California Reparations Task Force Report Marathon Read, Monday through Friday, 8:30 p.m. Pacific Standard. All right, so we're going to get the music queued up shortly, and then we will be getting in to this read. All right. Let's go back and pull up the document. And then we will continue where we left off yesterday. Just pulling that up right now. Thanks everyone for your patience as we continue on with this journey and the road to reparations. All right, racial terror. All right, I just need to check one thing real quick just to make sure that my mic, test 1, test 2 is working. Okay, test 1, test 2. Okay, everything is working, at least on my end. I don't know if anybody wants to comment in the comments that y'all can hear me. Hopefully you can. Pretty sure you can. But on that note, we will begin. Chapter 3, Racial Terror. The introduction. Enslavement was followed by decades of violence and intimidation intended to subordinate African Americans across the United States. Racial terror, and lynchings in particular, pervaded every aspect of pre- and post-enslavement Black life. African Americans faced threats of violence when they tried to vote, when they tried to buy homes in white neighborhoods, when they tried to swim in public schools, and when they made progress through the courts or in legislation. Led and joined by prominent members of society and enabled by government officials, ordinary citizens terrorized African Americans to preserve a caste system that kept, and I'm just interjecting, and keeps, continue, African Americans from building the same wealth and political influence as white Americans. Racial terror also continued the generational trauma that began during enslavement. While lynching, mob violence, and other forms of racial terror are no longer socially acceptable, the threat and legacy of terror continue to haunt Black communities. Such violence has found a modern form in extrajudicial killings of African Americans by police and vigilantes. Racial terror targeted at successful African Americans has contributed to the present wealth gap between Black and white Americans. Today, the monitoring of polling places by white supremacist groups invokes a history of violent suppression of Black voters. This chapter chronicles the racial terror inflicted on African Americans, including in California, and the lasting impact of racial terror. First, this chapter addresses the overarching purpose of racial terror as a method of social control. Second, this chapter will identify the perpetrators of racial terror, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, and their objective of preserving their dominance in society. This chapter paid special attention to the Klan's history and spread in California. Third, this chapter will discuss the various forms of racial terror, such as lynching, mob violence, and sexual violence. So just heads up, if we come to that chapter in terms of sexual violence, just got to put that disclaimer out there that, you know, there might be some explicit content in there. So just want to put that disclaimer out there. The chapter also identifies numerous instances of racial terror in California. This chapter shows how racial terror allowed white Americans to politically, economically, and socially subordinate African Americans. Finally, this chapter will discuss the consequences of racial terror, such as intergenerational trauma and the racial wealth gap, which continue to this day. Objectives of racial terror: social, political, and economic oppression. The practice of racial terror began during enslavement and has continued ever since, developing through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the 20th century, and today. A critical key to understanding the widespread use of racial terror is recognizing how its perpetrators sought to oppress African Americans socially, psychologically, politically, and economically in order to maintain a racial hierarchy. As the journalist Isabel Wilkerson argues, a caste system is a social hierarchy created by people in a community that separates groups of human beings based on ancestry, skin color, or other characteristics that cannot be changed. I'm going to just repeat that real quick. As the journalist Isabel Wilkerson argues, a caste system is a social hierarchy created by people in a community that separates groups of human beings based on ancestry, skin color, or other characteristics that can't be changed. All right. In a caste system, one group of human beings is believed to be superior, while other groups are believed to be inferior and treated as less than human. In the racially ordered caste system of the United States, white people occupy this higher social position. One pillar holding up the American racial caste system is the use of physical and psychological terror, which serves to control African Americans and prevent resistance. For this caste system to continue functioning, the rest of society, including government officials, only need to look the other way. For state and local government officials, this is a neglect of their duty to protect. In America, for centuries, the perpetrators of racial terror have rarely been held accountable for their violence, and so they have continued to enforce their dominant caste position. The system of racial terror in America started during enslavement, when whipping was a tool to control enslaved people and break their spirit. Enslavers openly publicized their use of violence. When an enslaved person sought freedom by escaping, enslavers sometimes turned to torture or invited others to kill the freedom seeker. White enslavers could thus use a public display of violence to demonstrate their power over Black enslaved persons. scare enslaved persons into submission and uphold the institution of enslavement. Rebellions of the enslaved were also violently suppressed. For example, white officials purportedly discovered an extensive conspiracy of insurrection in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. The enslaved, led by the free black carpenter Denmark Vesey, Ashe, allegedly plotted to take over the city and kill all of its white residents, including women and children. After the discovery of the alleged conspiracy, Vesey was arrested along with dozens of enslaved persons. Confessions and testimony against the alleged conspirators were procured, in at least some instances by coercion and torture. The prosecution had no physical evidence to support its case. In the end, Vesey and 34 others were executed, although no insurrection ever occurred and no white person was actually killed. Indeed, there is significant doubt as to whether any such insurrection plot ever existed. Then Governor of South Carolina, Thomas Bennett, condemned the trial as hasty and unreliable. His brother-in-law, Supreme Court Justice William Johnson, described the proceedings as perjury and legal murder. Wow. Interjection. Yeah, I read a real good book on Denmark Vesey. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. But yeah, it was an excellent book. It's been about 2 years since I read it, but if anybody wants to get further information on the quote-unquote uprising of Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, check out some books and resources on it. Anyway, let's get back to it. After the formal end of enslavement, Black Southerners began to gain political and economic influence. As discussed in Chapter 2 on enslavement, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 gave voting rights to African Americans, and following the law's enactment, Black voter turnout reached nearly 90% in many jurisdictions. During Reconstruction, approximately 2,000 Black men held a public office, including 600 Black state legislatures, 18 Black state executive officials, 16 Black representatives elect to Congress, and 2 of the nation's first Black senators. Nearly 20% of all public officials in the South were Black between 1870 through 1876. In spite of violence and other obstacles, Black Southerners began owning land, particularly in the Upper South: Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Black land ownership grew to such an extent that by 1910, nearly half of the Black farmers in the Upper South owned land. In addition, Black literacy rates surged from approximately 20% in 1870 to approximately 70% in 1920. In 1876, partially as a result of a disputed presidential election, Reconstruction came to an end. In exchange for Democrats not blocking the certification of Republican Rutherford B. Hayes as president, Hayes and other Republicans agreed to remove federal troops from key locations of political conflict in the South. With the end of Reconstruction, supporters of white supremacy returned to power. They regained political, social, and economic control and prevented African Americans from voting. After federal troops no longer had a strong presence in the South, white Southerners intensified the violent oppression of African Americans. As shown in detail below, racial terror took on many forms throughout American history: lynchings, massacres, intimidation, murders, beatings, and police killings. Today, extrajudicial killings of African Americans by police and vigilantes represent a modern form of racial terror. White Americans feared that newly empowered African Americans would destroy the racial hierarchy. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists beat, burned, and killed African Americans. Terror pervaded every aspect of Southern life and had a devastating effect on the psyche of African Americans. The perpetrators' principal goal was to use violence and intimidation to prevent Black people from voting, achieving equality. and amassing political and economic power. For example, white supremacists murdered black political activists in the 1873 Colfax Massacre and black military members in the 1876 Hamburg Massacre. The Supreme Court's 1876 decision in United States versus Cruikshank enabled such violence to continue by making it more difficult to prosecute. According to then Governor of Louisiana, Cruikshank established the principle that hereafter no white man could be punished for killing a Negro. All right, I'm gonna post that in there real quick. Man, family, just people be on one, man. All right. White supremacists often targeted the greatest perceived threats to the caste system: black political, economic, and social activities, and those perceived to be accomplished members of the black community. After the end of Reconstruction, government actors in the South did little to correct the view that black people did not deserve human dignity or basic legal and political rights. Across the country, white people often rejected the idea that African Americans were equal to white Americans and used violence to preserve America's racial caste system. As explained below, racial terror advanced three main goals: maintaining the superior social position of white people, destroying black economic competition and stealing black wealth, and limiting the political influence of black people while advancing white supremacy through government offices. Pause. All right. Perpetrators of Section 3, perpetrators of terror, private citizens, government support. Throughout American history, from enslavement to the present day, private citizens and government actors have perpetrated and enabled racial terror. Ordinary people committed heinous acts of violence, while others did nothing, watched or obstructed investigations. Meanwhile, government officials often did nothing to prevent or prosecute racial terror and sometimes encouraged or assisted the perpetrators. Indeed, white supremacists and Ku Klux Klan members have held positions in all levels of American government. Among the numerous perpetrators of racial terror, the Ku Klux Klan was especially prominent. The KKK is not the only hate group in American history, and oftentimes racial violence was and is committed by individuals unassociated with an organized group. But because the KKK has been active and influential for several intervals during its long history, it is centrally important to the history of racial terror in the United States. Throughout its history, the Klan has targeted members of all racial groups, as well as Jews, Catholics, and others, but its origins were anti-black. The KKK was especially powerful during the three periods. The first iteration of the KKK lasted from 1866 until 1869. After several decades of dormancy, the second iteration of the KKK lasted from 1915 until about 1944. The third version of the KKK arose in the 1950s and 1960s and went into decline in the 1980s. Each of these iterations will be discussed in greater detail below. Origins of the Ku Klux Klan. The first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan took shape in early 1866 during Reconstruction and formally disbanded in 1869. After the Civil War ended, many white Southerners represented Reconstruction and its policies, which threatened their superiority. Reconstruction policies led to social, political, and economic gains by formerly enslaved people. Around this time, the KKK emerged to oppose Reconstruction, led by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest and a group of Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee. The first version of the KKK consisted of ex-Confederates and other white Southerners, and it was tactically supported by most white Southerners. Their hooded costumes were intended to represent the ghosts of Confederate soldiers and evoke the history of slave patrols. Their hoods also allowed the Klan members to remain anonymous as they spread fear and violence. In order to exert control over the black labor force and maintain white supremacy, the Klan used fear tactics and violence such as robbery, rape, arson, and murder. The Klan was effective at targeting its violence and intimidation tactics at black voters, including hanging and beating black official holders. It is unknown how many black people were killed by white supremacists during Reconstruction, though it is estimated to be in the high thousands, if not tens of thousands. In the late 1860s, the KKK began to decline as it succumbed to infighting and increased federal scrutiny. The Federal Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, in conjunction with federal policing, helped weaken the Klan. When the Klan formally disbanded by the end of Reconstruction, the Klan had achieved its objectives as white Southerners were able to openly revive many aspects of life during enslavement. Having effectively intimidated and suppressed black voters, and without the presence of federal troops to protect black voters, white Southerners were successful in retaking control of state governments. Once in control, white supremacists passed laws to take away the rights that black Southerners had gained during Reconstruction. It also became less necessary to wear a mask to commit violent crimes against African Americans, as public lynching became an openly accepted part of Southern culture and was tolerated by law enforcement. State and local governments often looked the other way or supported the Klan. Although state governments passed laws in response to the KKK's violence, these laws were seldom locally enforced. Sheriffs, prosecutors, local witnesses, and jurors were sympathetic to white supremacy or afraid of retaliation. Some attacks were even led by local police. Thus, few KKK members ever went to prison for their crimes. And while the Federal Enforcement Acts of the early 1870s helped lead to the dissolution of the KKK, the Supreme Court largely nullified the Enforcement Acts with its 1876 decision in United States versus Cruikshank, which hindered federal prosecutions and enabled white supremacist violence. Second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. The second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan began in 1915, continued through the late 1820s and 1830s, and disbanded by 1944. After the end of Reconstruction, the Klan remained dormant until 1915, when the California film industry played a unique role in reviving the Klan. That year, celebrated filmmaker D.W. Griffith released The Birth of a Nation, which was based on Thomas Dixon's novel, The Klansman. Made in and around Los Angeles, The Birth of a Nation is acknowledged both as one of the most pioneering and most racist films in cinematic history. President Woodrow Wilson praised The Birth of a Nation and showed the film at the White House. A federal government endorsement of white supremacy and anti-blackness. Let's see. In writing The Klansman, Dixon openly wished to depict the suffering of white Southerners during Reconstruction and to advocate white supremacy. The Birth of a Nation, recognized as historically inaccurate racist propaganda, adhered closely to the source material's racism. For instance, the film portrayed lynching as rightful retribution against a black man accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. Griffith would later say that the heroic depiction of the Klan coming to rescue the South from black advancement during Reconstruction was needed to serve the purpose. Man, that dude was on one. Man, who greenlit this? Anyway. Probably some racists. All right, interjection. All right, get back to it. Here we go. The Birth of a Nation was a nationwide blockbuster, and its popularity led directly to the KKK's revival just months after its release. During a 5-year national roadshow of the film from 1915 to 1919, a scholar found that the film incited significant increases in racial violence. The counties where the film was shown were 5 times more likely to have a lynching or race riot, and 3 times more likely to have a KKK chapter after the movie's arrival. As a result of the surge in recruitment, there were 4 to 5 million Klan members by the mid-1920s. Wow. The film remained a Klan recruiting tool for decades. Unlike the first iteration of the Klan, this version had a broader geographic base of support beyond the South, including in California. The second version of the Klan was generally considered to be less violent, as it focused on gaining influence through the political process. In this regard, it succeeded. During the 1920s, the Klan's membership included state government officials in Alabama, Colorado, Georgia, Indiana, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Oregon, and Texas. Neither major political party was willing to formally repudiate the Klan out of fear of political repercussions. Regardless of its political turn, the second iteration of the Klan remained violent. In the summer of 1921, the Klan engaged in whippings and tar and feathered raids. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Klan also used acid, to brand the letters Klan on the foreheads of African Americans, Jews, and others whom the Klan considered to be anti-American. In the mid-1920s, the Klan launched a terror campaign including lynchings, shootings, and whippings against African Americans, Jews, Catholics, Mexicans, and other immigrant groups. Eventually, after a series of scandals, infighting, and a change in public perception of its image, the second iteration of the Klan lost credibility and its memberships declined in the late 1920s and 1930s. Third iteration of the Ku Klux Klan and hate groups today. A third version of the Ku Klux Klan arose in the 1950s and 1960s. While the KKK still exists today, it has been in decline since the late 1980s. This time, the Klan returned to its anti-black roots to counter the social and political gains sought by the civil rights movement. This version of the Klan was particularly violent against African Americans. African Americans and civil rights workers in the South. For example, in 1963, the Klan detonated a bomb at a Birmingham Baptist church that killed 4 black girls and injured several more. Ashe, 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 ashe. KKK members also murdered 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi in 1964. As recently as 1981, Klansmen in Mobile, Alabama lynched black 19-year-old Michael Donald. Ashe, 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 ashe. His mother brought a civil suit against the Klan and won a $7 million award after one of the perpetrators admitted he was carrying out an organization-wide directive to harass, intimidate, and murder black people. An essential part of the success of the Klan is that their actions and ethos were sanctioned by white society, a recurring theme in the history of racial terror. Rarely did the perpetrators face punishment, as ministers, editors, sheriffs, police officers, judges, and elected officials ignored or participated in the violence. Having supporters and members in prominent positions of power allowed the Klan to act with impunity. For example, the Klan was able to commit lynchings in front of a public audience and leave bodies on display, all without intervention by law enforcement. Witnesses often obstructed any investigation to prosecution for these acts by refusing to give information. Police not only refused to intervene, but also gave the Klan information about potential targets. Thus were the KKK-led, white society followed, participated, and looked on. While the KKK no longer enjoys the degree of socio-political power it once held, contemporary white supremacist groups have taken up the KKK's mantle to threaten the dignified existence of African Americans and others. The 2017 white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, the Proud Boys, and a 2021 White Lives Matter rally in Orange County have variously invoked the symbols, propaganda, and ideology of the Klan. California. Neither racial terror nor the Klan were confined to the South. During Reconstruction, the federal government did not send troops to California as a non-slave state. This allowed white supremacy groups to flourish in the West. The Western Klan complemented their Southern counterparts by violently asserting white superiority against the perceived threat of racial outsiders. As the black population in California was relatively small at the time, the Klan and other hate groups mainly terrorized Chinese communities. During the second iteration of the Klan, California became a strong Klan state with a sizable and violent Klan resurgence in the 1920s. Shortly after the release of The Birth of a Nation, the Klan emerged in San Francisco, establishing a KKK presence in California for the first time. Klan chapters in Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose soon followed. The Klan's national magazine, Imperial Nighthawk, shows that California ranked 11th out of all 48 states in terms of the number of KKK events held between March 23rd and November 24th, by hosting 89 events in the 20-month period. California even outranked the old enslavement states of Mississippi, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Wow. California's Klan consisted of prominent individuals who held positions in civil leadership and police departments. Its members were largely middle-class, educated Protestants who, in socioeconomic terms, were not much different from their neighbors. These Klan members registered to vote in higher percentages than non-members, joined civic organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and Rotary Club, and sought political power by running for elected office or supporting candidates who sympathized with the Klan. The California Klan exerted significant political influence in the 1920s, winning seats on city councils, gaining control of the press and airways in some towns, and officials were Klan members or had Klan ties, including the mayor, district attorneys, and police officers. Due to aggressive recruitment of efforts beginning in 1921, several Klan branches formed in Los Angeles. Klan chapters also formed in the nearby communities of Santa Monica, Huntington Beach, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, Long Beach, Glendale, San Pedro, and Anaheim. By the 1920s, the Los Angeles Police Department was a den of corruption that was infiltrated with Klan members who practiced retaliatory policing in the city's black neighborhoods. In speaking to the police, you are frequently talking to the Klan, warned the Eagle, a black Los Angeles newspaper. Shout out to the Eagle. Los Angeles Deputy Sheriff Nathan Barker regularly recruited Klan members to the Los Angeles Police Department and was thought to be a member of the Klan himself. On April 22, 1922, more than 100 armed and hooded Klansmen broke into the Inglewood home of Spanish immigrants. The Klansmen forced the couple's two teenage daughters to disrobe and ransack the house. The Klansmen then brutally beat, bound, and gagged the father and his brother, dragged them to a car, and dumped them 6 miles away. 37 Klansmen were indicted for the Inglewood raid, but in a trial that the NAACP called a farce, all were acquitted. The raid prompted an investigation by the district attorney, who obtained membership lists revealing that the Klan had infiltrated all levels of state and local government. There were 3,000 Klan members in Los Angeles County, over 1,000 in the city limits, and 3 Klan members on the district attorney's own staff. LAPD Chief Louis D. Oakes and County Sheriff William Traeger were also identified as members. Law enforcement from nearly every city in California appeared on the list, including 25 San Francisco police officers. Even after the Inglewood raid exposed the breadth of Klan membership, and after the legislature passed an anti-Klan bill, the Klan still proceeded to hold 9 events in Los Angeles between March 23rd and April 24th. The raid and its aftermath inspired Klan members and caused the Klan to redouble its efforts. In 1929, Klan supporters helped elect John C. Porter, who had a past with the Klan, as mayor of Los Angeles. And in the 1930s, even after enthusiasm for the Klan began to subside, the Klan still remained active in Los Angeles and the surrounding community, with rallies attended by thousands of people and cross burnings. In December 1939, the Klan ceremoniously marched through downtown Los Angeles, burning crosses in full view of thousands of people. Beyond Los Angeles, the Klan was active throughout Southern California, including Orange County, Riverside, and San Diego. In Anaheim, by 1923, the Klan had most 900 members. That's just in Anaheim. Out of a total population of about 6,000. Wow. Its members generally held more prestigious jobs than the rest of the white population and were politically and civically active. The Anaheim Klan burned crosses and held rallies, drawing thousands of people. One such event, an initiation in July 1924, attracted 20,000 people and included a parade of Klansmen with a marching band, airplanes, and fireworks. Wow. By spring 1924, the Klan dominated the Anaheim City Council, which had initiated a program to replace non-Klan city employees with its own members. Their plan succeeded. 10 new policemen out of 15 were members of the Klan. In Brea, 5 of the town's first 8 mayors were Klansmen, as were 6 of the 10 councilmen who sat on the board of trustees, half of the city's treasurers, half of the city's engineers. All right, I'm gonna continue. This is just redonkulous. Half of its city clerks, half of its city marshals, and 2/3 of its fire chiefs between 1924 and 1936. And in Fullerton, from 1918 to 1930, 7 of 18 city councilmen were Klansmen. God. Guess California knows how to party. The Riverside Klan were successful recruiters, claiming over 2,000 members in the 1920s. In Riverside, the Klan held mass events that attracted thousands of people and included parades with marching bands, floats, and Klan members in full regalia. The Riverside Klan prioritized policing interracial contact, which meant monitoring Black residents' activities. For example, the Klan was preoccupied with the city's 1922 settlement with the NAACP to desegregate a white-only pool. In response, they targeted Black swimmers with humiliation and violence. The Riverside Klan gained political influence and, in 1927, helped elect a mayor, Edward M. Dighton, who openly boasted about his support from the Klan. In the 1930s, Riverside Sheriff Carl Rayburn openly sympathized with the Klan, and KIGY, meaning Klan I Greet You, was painted on streets and sidewalks throughout the county. The Klan's membership in Riverside decreased in the 1930s, but they still made appearances and burned crosses. The San Diego Klan in the 1920s and 1930s focused on using violence and other intimidating tactics to chase the quote-unquote wetbacks across the border. The Klan in the 1930s also merged with other racist and fascist groups such as the Silver Shirts League that were focused on attacking African Americans, Latino Americans, and Jews. The Klan in the Central Valley. The Ku Klux Klan had an active presence in Fresno and Kern County. As of 1922, a local Fresno newspaper reported over 240 alleged Klansmen in Fresno County, and Klan held public events and parades with as many as 600 attendees during the early to mid-1920s. The investigation in the aftermath of the Inglewood raid also revealed that a number of Fresno officials were Klan members. In the early 1920s, the Klan actively recruited in Kern County and developed what was considered the most violent Klan chapter in California. I would believe that. In Kern County, in 1922 alone, there were over 100 cases of Klan violence, which included extrajudicial beatings, kidnappings, and tar and feathering. In 1922, a local newspaper reported that several high-ranking officials in Kern County were associated with the Klan, including the deputy sheriff, the police chief, the board of supervisors, and a former assistant district attorney. Although the Klan's influence started to decline in the 1930s, white supremacist culture persisted in Kern County in the decades that followed. As recently as the 1960s, a sign across the Kern River between Oldell and Bakersfield read, N-I-G-G, you get the rest. Don't let the sun set on you in Oldell. There were also unconfirmed reports that a similar sign was spray painted on the same bridge as recently as the late 1990s. In 1981, 3 Klan members were arrested for burning a cross on the front lawn of a black family in the Kern County town of Boron. And Klan rallies were reported as recently as 1987. In the early 1990s, black motorists were attacked on the streets of Oldell by whites hurling racial slurs and epithets. In the 2000s, members of the white supremacist group of the Peckerwoods were involved in multiple violent acts against Black, Hispanic, and Asian American residents that involved the use of racial slurs. The Klan in Northern California and the Bay Area. The Klan established a presence in the Bay Area during the 1920s. By 1922, there were Klan chapters in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. In addition to burning crosses, Klan chapters in the Bay Area held rallies, initiation events, and public parades, which were attended by thousands. In Oakland, the political active Klan took control of the city government to create policy that would limit black home ownership, including by embracing restrictive covenants. Between 1921 and 1924, the Oakland Klan grew to at least 2,000, and the chapter enjoyed political success well into the 1920s, winning an election for county sheriffs in 1926 and city commissioner in 1927. The Oakland Klan also operated as a vigilante group, accompanying federal agents on prohibition raids. All right, so quick pause there. All right, so let's see where we at. All right. Forms of racial terror, violent tools of social control. Sorry, fam, just give me a second. Just gonna cue up some different music here. All right, forms of racial terror, violent tools of social control. Racial terror has taken many forms throughout its long history. Although the primary component of racial terror is physical violence, perpetrators of racial terror have also destroyed and repossessed black property. And given the public nature of racial terror, overt action has been unnecessary. Threats and intimidation have often successfully kept African Americans from voting, living in certain neighborhoods, and exercising other civil rights. As one scholar has argued, fear of physical death not only hinders the possibility of freedom, but it also limits productive and meaningful living. As the oppressed submit to oppression and preserve biological life, they invariably suffer a degree of psychological and social death. From Reconstruction onward, racial terror undermined African Americans' legal rights with a lasting social repercussions by attacking African Americans who were never found guilty in a court of law. Racial terror popularized the idea that Black people bear a presumption of guilt, contrary to the presumption of innocence, which the Supreme Court has described as foundational to our criminal law. Many white lynch mobs killed Black criminal suspects who were later found to be innocent. Some Black men were even lynched after a jury found them innocent of their alleged offense. White people justified racial terror as a mode of self-defense against African Americans, as a tactic to deter future perpetrators, regardless of whether a crime had actually been committed. This history of racial terror reinforced a view that African Americans were dangerous criminals who posed a threat to white society. Lynching. The key features of lynching. The most gruesomely iconic form of racial terror was lynching. Violent and public acts of torture, which were largely tolerated by officials at all levels of government. Such violence traumatized Black people throughout the country, although it most frequently occurred in the South. Although lynchings were carried out against individual victims, the practice of lynching was ultimately aimed at the entire Black community. Indeed, historians have described the trauma of lynchings as a contagion that has a multiplier effect across families, communities, and generations. Much like Jim Crow laws and racial segregation, lynching was primarily a method of enforcing the political, economic, and cultural exploitations of African Americans. For instance, after Booker T. Washington visited the White House to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt, South Carolina Senator Benjamin Tillman remarked, "Now that Roosevelt has eaten with that NIGG, you get the rest, Washington, we should have to kill 1,000 NIGG, you get the rest, plural, to get them back to their places." Lynching was often carried out as a public spectacle. It did not simply involve hanging. Rather, public lynching often featured the prolonged torture, mutilation, dismemberment, and/or burning of the victim. These events attracted large crowds of white people, often numbering in the thousands, which included elected officials, prominent citizens, and entire families, including children. Children were given front row views of the victim, imprinting upon their minds for the rest of their life the concept that Black people do not deserve human dignity. The white press justified and promoted these carnival-like events, while vendors sold food and printers produced postcards featuring photographs of the lynching and corpse. Spectators would fight over fingers, ears, toes, sexual organs, and other body parts as souvenirs. Pause. The physical objects associated with a lynching were prized mementos for the crowd. The publicity of lynchings not only terrorized African Americans, but also allowed white communities to economically and politically benefit. The terror of being lynched prevented African Americans from achieving political power and preserved them as a compliant and intimidated workforce. This, in turn, largely maintained the Southern economy as it was during enslavement. And while lynching was overwhelmingly, though not exclusively, a Southern phenomenon, its effects were felt throughout the United States, just as white supremacists intended to victimize and oppress all African Americans. Lynchings to maintain white supremacy. Lynchings were based. Okay, here we go. Lynchings to maintain white supremacy. Lynchings were based on a broad range of perceived violations of the racial caste system. Hundreds of black people were lynched after being accused of murder or rape, though almost none were legally convicted of their alleged crimes. Regardless, lynching is never an acceptable form of punishment. Many lynchings were based on weak or contrived evidence. For example, white men perpetrated the myth of the unbridled, brutish black rapist to justify lynching black men for allegedly sexually assaulting white women. The lynchings of black men accused of rape or sexual assault often involved castration, which underscored how white men felt threatened by black men and used lynching to attack black manhood. All right, I'm not even gonna say anything about that one, about the castration part. I mean, there's been many theories, interjections about, the jealousy of certain individuals who we call the dominant society with men of their race and the use of castration. But I think you guys can get the point where I'm going to that. Anyway, back to the story, to the report. Many lynchings were based on much more minor accusations. According to the Tuskegee Institute, approximately 30% of lynching victims were accused of nonviolent offenses. Some victims were lynched only for minor social transgressions or for demanding basic rights and fair treatment. Black victims were lynched for referring to a white police officer by name, associating with white women, accidentally bumping into a white woman, quote, passing, end quote, as white, speaking out about racial inequality, testifying on behalf of a black defendant, and refusing to take off an army uniform after returning for World War II. Okay, we're gonna put that one. Refusing to take off an army uniform after returning from World War I. That is crazy. I mean, brothers was doing their thing, fighting for the government, for the United States. Let me come back with this. Unacceptable, man. Unacceptable. African Americans were also lynched for asserting their labor rights and economic rights. For example, in 1918, a black man in Earl, Arkansas refused to work on a white-owned farm without pay. In response, the white citizens of the city cut him into pieces with butcher knives and hung his remains from a tree. Hey, Ashe. In numerous instances, African Americans were also lynched after disputes over wages or debts. In such disputes, if a white person became violent and a black person reacted in self-defense, the black person was often lynched for murder or assault. By killing African Americans for seeking fair judgment or fair treatment, or for trivial social disputes, white Americans continued to assert the total control they held over black lives during slavery. Apart from responding to specific accusations, lynchings were used to drive black residents from a community. For example, after a 1912 lynching in Forsyth County, Georgia, white vigilantes distributed leaflets demanding that all black people leave the county or suffer deadly consequences. As a result, the black population dropped from 1,100 to 30 in 8 years. And in 1918, in Unicoi County, Tennessee, after lynching a black man, a group of white men rounded up 60 black residents, including children, and forced them to watch the corpse burn. The white people told the black people in the town to leave the county within 24 hours. Lynchings also united white Americans of all socioeconomic levels. The public violence of lynchings portrayed the white population as strongly allied against the perceived threat of African Americans. White mobs asserted their racial superiority by publicly torturing and killing black victims. Through the Jim Crow period, white Americans experienced divisions along political, economic, and social lines. Although poor white Americans may have lived in conditions more similar to those of poor African Americans, lynchings helped prevent interracial class-based alliances by unifying white Americans around a core purpose and identity. Complicit government officials. Government actors, including police officers, prosecutors, judges, and elected officials, tactically approved or assisted in lynchings. Law enforcement officers released black people who had been incarcerated to mobs, placed black prisoners in areas where lynch mobs were known to gather, joined mobs to find African Americans, and assisted with lynchings. Prosecutors and law enforcement regularly failed to identify and try lynchers for their crimes. Only 1% of all lynchings after 1900 resulted in a conviction. Judges contributed to these outcomes by presiding over a process that systemically excluded African Americans from juries, mistreated black witnesses, and held trials in jurisdictions with a racist bias. Local coroners and coroners' juries refused to indict lynchers and made impossible conclusions, such as ruling a death was a suicide after a black farmer was found riddled with bullets. Oh my gosh, what? Throughout the South, state and local politicians. All right, I'm back. Throughout the South, state and local politicians protected the perpetrators of violent acts instead of protecting black Southerners from extrajudicial violence. Some governors, rather than condemn lynchings, made statements that focused on the accused crime of the lynched black person, suggesting that the lynching was justified, and in other cases, affirmatively supported the lynching. And government officials outside the South did little to stop the campaign of widespread lynching. National leaders, for their part, failed to pass even one of more than 100 anti-lynching bills that were proposed in Congress between 1852 and 1951. Okay. I'm gonna post this. Yeah, if I recall correctly, I think there's currently an anti-lynching bill that still hasn't passed yet. The public was also complicit. Studies show that thousands of white people at all levels of class and educational status participated directly in lynch mobs. Many more participated as spectators, and millions did nothing. Participants, meanwhile, were protected by a code of silence. Because witnesses refused to cooperate with law enforcement, criminal investigations were thwarted, and the perpetrators of lynchings were able to avoid accountability. The prevalence of lynching over time. Despite numerous efforts, it is impossible to know how many black people were killed by lynching. In the late 19th century, Ida B. Wells, Ashe, started the Red Record efforts to identify incidences of extreme racial violence for research, advocacy, and public policy purposes. Other researchers and activists have followed Wells' lead, but there is a disagreement on figures among those who study racial terror. Researchers use different criteria of what counts as a lynching, and perpetrators hide their crimes to list just 2 reasons that there is no definitive number of Black lynching victims. By any measure, however, lynching occurred in every region of the United States with victims of all races and genders. And despite disagreement over exact numbers, there is a consensus that between the Civil War and World War II, thousands of African Americans were lynched in the United States and were the primary targets of lynch mobs. The nonprofit organization Equal Justice Initiative, for example, counts nearly 6,500 lynchings nationwide between 1865 and 1950. That's an interesting time period to Reconstruction, right? Any count of lynchings, however, will fall short of the true number as a result of inadequate reporting at the time, lack of documentation, cover-ups by perpetrators and local officials, and other gaps in the evidence. In the 1890s, when the frequency of lynchings peaked, an average of 104 Black people were estimated to have been killed each year by lynch mobs. Then, as Black Southerners moved north and west, lynching rates steadily declined during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and lynchings eventually became extraordinary events. Thus, when 15-year-old Emmett Till was lynched in 1954 for allegedly whistling at a white woman, and when a white mob abducted Mac Charles Parker from his jail cell and lynched him in 1959, the killings provoked national public outrage. However, the decline in lynchings did not correspond with an end to the racial caste system that led to lynchings in the first place. Rather, the decline can be attributed to strict segregation laws, tactics of disenfranchisement, and the surge of the death penalty. Beginning in the early 1900s, white Southerners began to fear that barbaric imagery of lynchings would harm the Southern economy. The death penalty offered a more respectable form of violence and the appearance of the rule of law. As early as 1930s, lynchings were often avoided when government actors made clear that the accused would receive a swift judicial conviction and execution. While there is no conclusive evidence proving that the death penalty replaced lynching in the South, data shows that executions increased as lynchings declined. Indeed, Southerners themselves refer to these executions as legal lynchings. And Southern leaders argue that African Americans would be intimidated and controlled just as effectively with the death penalty. And legal lynchings, like actual lynchings, disproportionately victimized African Americans. From the 1890s to the 1950s, between 53 and 81% of lynchings and executions were of African Americans. Although African Americans represented approximately only 10% of the entire U.S. population. By 1915, court-ordered executions outpaced lynchings in the former slave states for the first time. And by the 1930s, 2/3 of those executed were Black, a trend that would continue. While Black people were executed for allegedly killing white people, the reverse was not true. As lynchings declined from 1930 to 1970, there was a sharp increase in the number of African Americans who were executed for rape, but there is no evidence that a white person was executed for raping a Black woman. I'm going to repeat that. Let me just get a libation. As lynchings declined from 1930 to 1970, there was a sharp increase in the number of African Americans who were executed for rape, but there is no evidence that a white person was executed for raping a black woman. According to one study, out of more than 11,000 executions in the United States, only 2 white men were executed for killing a black person. Another study of approximately 15,000 executions from colonial times to the 1990s found that white people were executed for killing black people in only 29 cases, and in most of those cases, the defendants had also killed white people. These trends in executions reinforce a central theme of lynching, that the lives of black people were worth less than those of white people. Mob violence. Whereas lynching involves group action against a person as a response to that person's alleged wrongdoing, mob violence involves assaults by civilians of one ethnic group on members of another ethnic group on the basis of their ethnicity. These tactics were often used together against the black community. Lynchings were sometimes followed by mob violence, with white mobs burning black homes, devastating black neighborhoods, and forcing black residents to relocate. Mob violence was motivated by the same objectives as lynchings, including extinguishing African Americans' political influence and economic gains, and maintaining social control over African Americans. The racial hierarchy benefited from mob violence. Mob violence was a ritual that built a sense of community among white people and helped the South to sustain a cohesive culture of white supremacy and enforce legal segregation. As discussed above, mass participation was a typical element of lynchings, which drew upwards of thousands of spectators. But mass violence was not strictly a Southern phenomenon. White mob violence occurred in several northern states prior to 1865, including New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. These northern white mobs, which numbered in the hundreds or thousands, attacked and killed black people and set fire to black properties. The violence was often accompanied by inaction or inadequate response by law enforcement. Virtually none of the perpetrators were prosecuted or convicted. Those that were received extremely lenient punishments. When white Americans felt African Americans threatened their superiority, mob violence sometimes escalated into massacres, destroying cohesive black communities and the prosperity that they built. Historically, these attacks have often been called riots or race riots, but these terms obscure the nature of this violence. Throughout Reconstruction, segregation, and the Civil Rights era, so-called riots were actually massacres. Yep. Pause. Yes, massacre would be a better term, better word used. In these attacks, white mobs proactively killed African Americans and destroyed black property, though the black victims were often blamed for inciting the violence in the immediate aftermath. This pattern of violence has evolved and continued through the 20th and 21st centuries, as it is discussed greater detail in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. Massacres inflicted tremendous damage upon black lives and property. It is estimated that over 100 such massacres occurred between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s. Among several notable examples, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is especially prominent. In 1921, Tulsa Race Massacre, especially prominent. In Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, a black man was arrested for allegedly assaulting a white woman. In response, a white mob looted, burned homes and businesses, and murdered at least 300 black people in Greenwood. a prosperous black neighborhood known as Black Wall Street. Over the course of 24 hours on May 31st and June 1st, the mob destroyed 35 square blocks, more than 1,200 black-owned homes, over 60 businesses, a hospital, a public library, and a dozen black churches. Thousands of black Tulsans were left homeless and placed in internment camps. Lawyer and reparations advocate Eric J. Miller has testified that in addition to death and destruction, the massacre inflicted catastrophic mental and emotional trauma upon the black survivors and their descendants. The destruction remained over generations as the city, state, and Chamber of Commerce worked to prevent rebuilding and turned away funding that could have benefited Greenwood. The Tulsa Race Massacre Commission confirmed that Tulsa officials not only did nothing to prevent the massacre, but also participated in the violence and provided firearms and ammunition to the mob. Indeed, the city and county police deputized hundreds of white people to participate in the massacre, and the Oakland National Guard joined the massacre as well. The commission's report confirmed that no one prosecuted or punished any of the perpetrators for the violent acts that occurred, despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt. Instead, the all-white grand jury falsely blamed black people for the massacre. As stated in the grand jury report, there was no mob spirit among the whites, no talk of lynching, and no arms. The assembly was quiet until the arrival of the armed Negroes, which precipitated and was the direct cause of the entire affair. This example also highlights the role of the government at all levels in mob violence, just as government had enforced the legal regime of slavery by looking the other way, declining to prosecute mob members, or by actively fomenting and assisting mob violence. Government officials enabled violent white mobs to devastate black communities. All right, just pause for a second. Just kind of seeing where we're at here. All right, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay. We'll probably take a pause and then come back with this on Monday when we hit 10 o'clock, because we probably won't be getting probably won't be getting to the end of this chapter here, so we'll continue this on Monday. But let me continue. Torture. Southern lynchings often included torture of the victim before death, in addition to burning, mutilation, and decapitation after death. Wow. The torture preceding public killings usually lasted hours and could involve shoving a hot poker iron down the victim's throat and pressing it against their body, gouging out eyes, castration, cutting off hands and feet, tearing into the flesh with a large corkscrew, and burning the victim alive. As historian Leon F. Litwack explains, the story of a lynching is a story of a slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly inventive forms of torture and mutilation. Torture was thus another method with which white people sought to punish black people for stepping beyond their relegated social roles. Victims were often tortured even if they were not convicted of any crime, such as when two brothers in Paris, Texas, were tortured for trying to escape abusive work conditions. As lynching became less common, As lynching became less common, so too did the accompanying torture. But just as lynching was replaced with the legal lynching of state executions, the police used torture to extract confessions from black suspects. The police objective was to quickly convict the suspects, thus even facing the death penalty. Black suspects were frequently denied a fair and impartial trial. For example, in 1938, Dave Canty, a black man, was arrested for killing a white woman and wounding another in the course of a robbery in Montgomery, Alabama. After hours of police questioning, Canty signed a written confession admitting responsibility for the attack. At trial, however, Canty testified from the witness stand that the police had forced him to confess by torturing him. He gave detailed information about the torture and his torturers, and he showed his wounds and scars to the jury. Police officers and prison staff, however, denied Canty's account of his torture, and at the conclusion of his 3-day trial, Canty was sentenced to death. Ashe. After a new trial reduced his sentence to life in prison, Canty died in the same prison in which he claimed to have been tortured. Unlike lynching, this form of torture was not public. In fact, hiding it was critical to supporting a racist system. It was difficult for victims and advocates to realize the prevalence of torture, and denials and secrecy made it more difficult to fight the practice. When torture was reported and individuals tried to bring charges, allegations and evidence were ignored and invalidated by white judges, prosecutors, and other officials. While this practice occurred throughout the country, it was especially prevalent in large cities like Chicago and New York City, as well as the American South. There were very rarely any consequences for violence used by police in coercing confessions. Police officers often denied the use of such violence, while claiming that regulating police work would lead to an increase in crime. Thus, the decline of lynching and public torture was not a sign of enlightenment. Rather, lynching and torture developed into more modern forms of racial violence, namely swift executions and coerced confessions. Evidence suggests that police continued to coerce confessions from suspects, including black suspects, leading to wrongful convictions and years of undeserved jail time. From the early 1970s to the early 1990s, for example, then Chicago Police Commander John Burge led officers in torturing over 125 suspects into confessing to crimes, most of whom were African American, and many of whom have said their confessions were false. Burge was convicted for lying under oath about the torture. Police killings and vigilantism. State-sanctioned violence against African Americans continues today in the form of extrajudicial violence by police officers and vigilantes. Police violence as a modern form of lynching. Throughout American history, including the present day, the police have held the power to strip black people of their rights and lives for any reason or for no reason at all. Police violence is a leading cause of death for black people in America. Today's extrajudicial killings have historical roots in the social control of slave patrols. The lynchings of the late 1800s and early 1900s and police violence against black Southerners during legal segregation. Slave patrols, which began in the early 1700s, were made up of white volunteers. Patrollers were empowered to forcibly discipline enslaved persons, crush potential uprisings, and return enslaved persons who had escaped to their enslavers. Like slave patrols, police violence during Jim Crow was intended to intimidate black communities and subordinate African Americans within the segregated social order. From the end of the Civil War through the early 20th century, racialized policing was often tailored to local concerns. in urban areas in response to growing economic competition between white workers and black workers moving to cities. The police targeted black residents with curfews, high incarceration rates, and violence, often deadly violence. In rural areas, sheriffs and deputy sheriffs enjoyed essential unchecked power from their white constituents. As a result, the police violently enforced the rates of social order against black citizens, even for seemingly minor transgressions. As recognized by the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, contemporary police killings and the trauma that they create are reminiscent of the past racial terror of lynching. Recent incidents of police violence demonstrate this connection. The British Broadcasting Company has collected a list of recent high-profile killings of African Americans by police, highlighting just a fraction of the more than 1,500 African Americans killed by police since 2015. In 2016, after a Minneapolis police officer killed Philando Castile during a traffic cop, Castile's sister said, "It's just like we're animals. It's basically modern-day lynching that we're seeing going on, except we're not getting hung by a tree anymore. We're getting killed on camera." Similarly, in 2020, George Floyd was stopped for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill, which could have been handled with a ticket. Instead, Floyd was killed by an officer kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Historian Erika Coleman described Floyd's death as a modern-day lynching. Ashe. Vigilantism continues today. Let's see. In addition to extrajudicial police violence, our country's history of lynching is reflected in the vigilantism taken against black people, even when they have not committed any offense. The Southern Poverty Law Center has compiled a list of African Americans and white activists killed during the Civil Rights Movement. More recent examples of this violence are the killings of Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery. In 2022, George Zimmerman shot and killed the unarmed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, who Zimmerman described as a, quote, suspicious person, end quote, in his neighborhood. After Zimmerman was acquitted for the shooting and the tradition of lynching, he auctioned his gun as a souvenir. Ashe, ashe. In 2020, while Ahmaud Arbery was out for a jog, he was chased, attacked, and killed by 3 white men who claimed he resembled a suspect in local break-ins, although no police reports were filed about the alleged break-ins. Arbery was unarmed, and as he lay dying on the ground, one of the white men called him a effing nigg. Arbery's family called the killings a lynching. The 3 attempted to use a citizen's arrest provision added into the Georgia Code of 1863. The men argued that the 1863 provision allowed them to arrest another person if a crime was committed within his immediate knowledge. The Georgia Code was drafted in part by Thomas R. Cobb, a legal scholar who claimed that a black mother, quote, suffers little, end quote, when her children are stolen from her, since she lacked maternal feelings. Cobb helped write principles of white supremacy in the Georgia law, including a provision that presumed African Americans were enslaved people unless proven otherwise. The citizen's arrest provision was significantly weakened in 2021 in the wake of Arbery's murder. As with lynchings, a lack of accountability appears to exist for police violence and vigilantism. The Guardian reports that out of 1,136 killings registered in 2015, only 18 law enforcement officers were charged with crimes. Moreover, the United States found that federal, state, and county regulations on use of force and firearms do not comport with international standards, which makes it more likely that extrajudicial violence against Black individuals will continue. All right, family. Woo, man, this is deep. Okay, we're gonna pause there. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so I think for Monday, we'll continue on this page with the section sexual violence and eugenics for Monday. Woo. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I don't even know what to say. This is really unfortunate. Maybe once we get done with the whole report, maybe we'll have like a get together and talk about this report, because yeah, it definitely is a hard chapter. Really difficult to get through this and really get, I was just pausing for a long time. I don't know about y'all, but it was just like a lot of ashés, as I was going through. Yeah. So everyone have a wonderful night. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe. Be blessed. Enjoy your family. If y'all, wherever y'all at in California, outside of California, a shout out to our family out in the South, from Florida all the way up on the East Coast. Hopefully y'all doing all right, with the hurricane season out there. Y'all stay safe, please, family. Protect yourself at all times. Protect your family at all times, not just physically, but mentally as well. As Ice Cube always says, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. All right, family, on that wonderful note, you guys have a wonderful night. Yep, shout out to Theo. Thanks for coming through, brother. And I'll see you on Monday. On that note, peace, love, and reparations.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have Black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total Black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, but I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.